right now. And it's going to be recorded and posted to our Woodland Stewardship Education YouTube page. So I'm going to put that link in the chat right now. And then at the end of the presentation, I'm going to just sort of dump in a ton of different links. The links will reference different things that come up in the talk. And I'll also put this, playlist, this YouTube page back again. Just so you can reference them. So the talk that I did a month ago will be on there, or it is on there. And then in about a week, a couple days from now, this recording will also be posted to the YouTube page. And then the last thing is the invitation to self-identify. So within Extension, we want to make sure that our programming is reaching basically everyone in the state of Maryland. And so it's really important that you all kind of give feedback um, and take this poll. Sorry, I just had to pull that up so that we know that we're doing well, or that where areas that we need to improve, basically who we need to sort of reach out to. So I just sent out a poll, or made a poll available. It's called an invitation to self-identify. So if you're willing and able, feel free to sort of use that, or fill that poll out. So again, I know who I need to reach appropriately with my programming. So I think that's it for housekeeping. Yeah, it looks like the poll is up and running. Thanks again for those who are doing it. All right. So a quick about these webinars to those who haven't called in yet. This is the second of 3 different presentations that I'm giving over fall of 2025. These programs, these webinars really are to provide basic level forestry and natural resources information and content to anyone, be that landowners, be that people who are students or just interested in forests in general. These webinars are supposed to be sort of for everyone. They also highlight current relevant research, because an extension, sort of our gig, is to take the research and then make it accessible to the public. And then, the last kind of thing that I'm trying to get out of these is to determine interest in future programming content. I'm relatively new in this position, and I really encourage you all to fill out an evaluation form at the end of the talk so that you can give sort of me some feedback on my teaching, one, but then also if you have ideas or thoughts on what kind of content might be relevant or of interest to you moving down the road. So let's jump into today. There's a lot to cover. Really hoping that I'm hoping there's time at the end that we'll sort of talk through some questions and answers here. But broadly, again, today is focused on forest dynamics. So I broke the talk up into 3 kind of big bins of content. And the first one focuses in on forest ecosystems and biodiversity, sort of just hammering home why those things are a big deal and why those things, you're probably hearing those in a lot of discourse around forests now. So I just wanted to talk a bit about what these concepts mean and what they sort of entail when we think about forests and then forest management down the road. Another bin is what influences forest growth and development. That's kind of, again, in reference to this forest dynamics title. So just sort of the ins and outs of the factors that basically dictate why things grow where they do. And then I'm going to sort of superimpose that on Maryland's landscape. And so we'll kind of get a sense of where forests might be located, or what factors in our state influence the forest growth and development. Last time I took a bit of time just to hammer home sort of specific research initiatives, and in this particular installment of the webinars, I'm just sprinkling this research and scholarship throughout. So again, at the end of the talk, I will put a ton of different links to resources in the chat, but you'll see these different resources and references come up throughout. All right, so to begin and to preface today, I wanted to just sort of talk about landscape patterns. I was a TA for a class when I was doing my graduate studies up in Vermont, And the lecturer, the professor of the class, Walt Pullman, was a field naturalist, and he ran this field naturalist program as well, and made a really sort of concerted effort to teach not only TAs, but then his students about the importance of landscape patterns. And so we'll talk a bit about this, but really these patterns sort of hold clues and information about the dynamics in play when you look at a landscape or an ecosystem. So sort of understanding the patterns and then sort of what drives those patterns, I think is really important to get a kind of holistic sense of what's going on and where. So this photo is of the rocky coast in New England. I know that today is focused on forests, but we see that patterns are relevant and sort of exist in many different kinds of ecosystems. So in this photo, you can kind of see here that algae and barnacles sort of they basically live in different parts of these rocks. They self-select based on how much water they get, the nutrients of the seawater. Not a limnologist, but basically you can see that there's sort of these distinct stripe patterns that sort of run across the landscape here, sort of these horizontal patterns that sort of show that there's different factors at play, sort of dictating where the life ends up on these rocks. And we can see this again in forests, like the sort of topic of conversation for this webinar. They're not necessarily as evident as sort of these distinct bands of colors on a rock, but across a landscape and in forests, we can see that these different dynamics sort of create patterns on a larger scale. So the photo on the left, you can see these dark patches of evergreen trees sort of across this larger forested landscape. But then even within forests, within forested stands, you can see how trees in canopies sort of, there's gaps around canopies. So trees sort of grow differently, and there's these gaps that appear, again, creating these patterns. So you can see those and then kind of think back about, what is actually causing or driving these noticeable trends. One call out that I wanted to make, this person, Tom Wessels, I'm not sure if anyone is familiar with him or his work. He is a professor up at Antioch College, which I believe is up in Massachusetts. But he's well known for this line of inquiry called forest forensics. Basically, he goes out and he sort of stands in a forest and says, okay, let's think about 100 years ago and what might have happened here. And you can sort of look around in the forest and pick out these different clues and patterns that then indicate or sort of, give evidence to what might have happened. So I'd highly recommend checking out this book, Reading the Forested Landscape. It's pretty accessible. And then he also has a great YouTube page as well, which I'll put the link in the chat later on in this presentation. But yeah, so Tom Wessels is kind of definitely of this train of thought or this philosophy, I guess, that you can sort of go out into the woods, go into a landscape and sort of pick out these patterns to then understand the history and the dynamics that are at play. So kind of the thesis of today is that the factors shaping Maryland forests are, one, closely tied to biodiversity, but these factors also help us to understand forests as we see them today and how they might shift or change in the future. Especially again with different sort of pressures like different changing climates, changing societal values, different changing economies, things like that. These sort of biotic and abiotic factors are really important to consider as well. All right, so like I mentioned, I have kind of three big bins of content. This is the first one. We're talking about forest ecosystems and biodiversity. One quick note, ecosystem level thinking is sort of relatively novel in the kind of the grand scheme of the sciences. I mean, the ecosystem concept has been around for quite a while, but thinking about landscapes and their interconnections with one another, when we're thinking about management and the impacts again of climate change or whatever, these ecosystems thinkers kind of are sort of a novel trend, I guess, in the sciences as of semi-recently. So you probably hear that term a lot, ecosystems. And to sort of clarify what ecosystems are, I just took kind of the stock definition and just and which is communities of organisms and their relationships with the living and non-living environment. So this image on the slide here, this is just from the southeast US, but here are sort of the different kinds of ecosystems that might exist in that region. Things like sawgrass prairies up in the top left, or coral reefs, spruce fir forests, wooded areas and beach environments. All these things sort of are representative of what an ecosystem could be. So you'll see that there's, living and non-living elements to these ecosystems, and they can differ quite a bit from one another. Forested ecosystems are pretty much the same thing. They're communities of organisms and their relationships. The one difference is that trees are the dominant plant life form. So again, it's not rocket science. We know that forests are made up of trees. And again, we can see that forest ecosystems span quite large, extensive landscapes. But then, when you dig into sort of the plot level and the sort of stand level within these ecosystems, you also see quite a bit of differentiation between the species that are there, including trees and other things as well, like fungi or other types of herbaceous plants or different wildlife as well. So I'm going to kind of go over key attributes of forest ecosystems. So the first kind of key attribute of what a forest ecosystem really is biodiversity. So that's that really strong link between the concept of biodiversity and forest ecosystems. It's that biodiversity really is an attribute of what these ecosystems are. And biodiversity refers to the richness of genes, species, and interactions among life forms. So that image that you see on the slide there basically sort of differentiates between these different types of biodiversity. And richness really just refers to how much of it there is. So that image and a few other images that you'll see on the slide comes from this text here from Malcolm Hunter. But you'll see that kind of the gene level diversity is kind of the base layer of importance. Like that's super important. And then that gets translated up into the different species that are around, both wildlife and plants and other things. And then we can kind of group that all together within a forest. And all these things sort of interact with one another. Another key attribute of forest ecosystems are the functions that they provide. Functions, we're just sort of referring to the work that is carried out by forest ecosystems. I'm sure some of you have heard the concept of ecosystem services, but that's sort of again, not newfangled, but it's a relatively novel concept that tries to capture this attribute of forests, this work that's carried out, and then sort of the benefits that we receive as people. So one of these functions is growth and production, like carbon capture or wood and fiber growth, as you can see really kind of evident in that photo on the left side of the screen. Regulating nutrient and water cycles is another super critical function that forests provide. Clean water really is filtered through forests, and that ultimately ends up in sinks like the Chesapeake Bay or the Atlantic Ocean. So we know that forests are really important in sort of regulating these different cycles. And then again, these forests provide habitat for wildlife, supporting that kind of species level biodiversity. The last key attribute of forest ecosystems is that of structure, which is the architecture of an ecosystem. Something that I think a lot of forest managers think is super cool to sort of manipulate. So these are components that include living and dead trees, logs, and shrubs, and then kind of how these different components are arranged. So the photo on the left part of the slide here is a photo that shows sort of a downed tree. You see in the center of the photo, if you can see it, but that's a dead tree that wildlife can use. Those are often called snags. So they're just dead standing trees that birds like to perch on or cavity nesters like to sort of make holes in. But you can see in that photo that there's a lot of diversity in sort of what structures are out there. There's big trees, there's small trees, there's some in the canopy, the upper story, and then there's some in the mid-story, and there's vegetation all throughout. So having a diversity, again, of these structures is really important. And then the image on the right side of the screen is again from that textbook that I showed you, and it just shows again sort of how groups can sort of be random, they can be clustered together, dependent on the species that are there. So to kind of hammer this point home, biodiversity influences forest function and structure. So what wildlife is there, what tree species are there, again, like this all sort of goes into how forest structure presents itself. Um, but then it's kind of almost like a chicken and an egg. This forest structure then influences, what wildlife exists, what genes are flowing through there, what sort of services that these ecosystems provide. So it's kind of a cool give and take that, things shape the environment, but then the environment definitely, has a role on what comes and what is able to thrive there. And I wanted to kind of connect this to, again, sort of relevant conversations or conversations that you might be hearing in your circles. So what you see on the slide here is the IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. Basically, what this is an intergovernmental organization that was put together in 2010 through the United Nations. And then this panel basically writes these massive reports based on different aspects of biodiversity and ecosystem services. One of my advisors up in Vermont, she was one of the co-authors in one of these reports. And basically, these reports pull in scientists from all over the world. So again, she was up in Vermont, but people were coming from everywhere. And they do these massive lit reviews to sort of get a sense of the state of our understanding of these certain things. Again, like biodiversity here. So the report that I'm pulling up is that, this assessment found that about 1 million species were threatened with extinction. And so kind of on a policy level, on a sort of global level, this is really why biodiversity has kind of come into the forefront of conversations when we're thinking about the role that forests play, the role that forest management can play, or stewardship, that, all these things really are dependent on one another. And biodiversity, just sort of how rich our genes, our species, our ecosystems are, these are sort of threatened currently based on the current science here. And again, I'll put the link to this report in the chat later on if you feel like digging through it. All right. So the next chunk of slides dig into forest growth and development. So these are aspects, these are sort of concepts that we might get a bit in the weeds here, but these are sort of the things that explain the patterns that I was mentioning earlier in the PowerPoint today. So I've kind of separated these concepts into two different bins. I keep saying that word, but the first things that we'll focus on are that of site characteristics, like soils and light and terrain. So these are often considered sort of abiotic factors or non-living factors that play really significant roles in what exists and where it exists. And then I'm going to shift to tree characteristics or more biotic factors. And this is, we'll delve into shade tolerance and regeneration mechanisms, but I do want to step back and say that, you could probably take many, many courses that delve into each of these specific different, subtopics. And this is going to kind of be a very broad level summary of each of these different characteristic types that might influence forest growth and development. And there's other things that play as well. So keep that in mind. I did want to make a quick shout out here. I'm pulling fairly heavily from this guide. Gonna do some quick advertisement 20 minutes in here. So this is The Woods in Your Backyard. This guide was developed by my coworkers, my colleagues here at University of Maryland Extension, but then also at Penn State and Virginia Tech as well. So this was written to sort of help small property or small acreage landowners go about making decisions on their landscape that might sort of help influence more wildlife or to sort of rewild lawns to sort of reduce mowing. So basically, this guide has a ton of different cool information that you could utilize. It is for sale, but I also did want to mention that there's an online course as well. So if you have an acre, couple different acres of lawn or yard, you can take this course and kind of get a guided approach to that workbook that I just mentioned, so you can sort of help make the best decisions you can. Basically, create a management plan for your parcel. So, like I mentioned, this figure is pulled from that book here, but I did want to pull it up to sort of highlight that this photo really captures much of what I was trying to articulate a few slides ago, that there are lots of abiotic factors at play when we think through sort of what trees grow where. And then if you're trying to plant trees or sort of make any sort of manipulations, really understanding the norms of what these abiotic factors are, how sunny it is, what the aspect is, whatever, we'll go through all these things. All these things are really important if, again, you're trying to cut trees or plant them or sort of dictate artificially, sort of manipulate what might happen in the future here. Um, so I'm going to focus first on soils. Again, I am not a soils scientist. There are people who dedicate lifetimes of research on soils. So I'm just simply scratching the surface here. No pun intended. But soils, as we know, are mineral and organic matter that supports growth of land plants. Forest soils are really rich because, they get a ton of inputs from the tree leaves and other things, going on in forest ecosystems. So these soils can differ in their depth, how they're made up of different nutrients, and then how they drain as well. So if they're sort of more sandy and well drained or more clay, that, the drainage isn't as significant. All these things sort of differ across different forested ecosystems. And those are often sort of dictated by the bedrock as well. So I put a red box around sort of the chunk that you might want to focus in on in this figure here that shows, again, how soils can differ, in this case, in depth and potentially drainage, even in a pretty small sort of cross section. And I know this is dramatized, but this is sort of a small subsection of the landscape here. So we see that the top of that ridge has much sort of shallower soils, that might support different kinds of tree species than the soils that sort of move down slope over time and kind of compact near the foot of that slope. So again, these soils vary and can vary even in small contexts as well, as we see here. I did want to point out, like I mentioned, I'm not a soil scientist, but there's many that exist in this country and in the world. I did want to point out this pretty awesome resource from UC Davis. They have a soil resource lab, and they have basically the equivalent of Google Maps, but with an overlay of soil data, which I think is collected from the Department of Agriculture. So it's this sort of federal state kind of partnership here. But if you click on that, you can in this presentation, I'll put the link in later, but the soil web resource on the, I guess, left side of your screen, you can put in different addresses and sort of see the different soil profiles where you're interested in looking. So the image on your screen here is just a satellite image of the farm where my office is located here in Western Maryland. And so those yellow lines denote sort of different pockets of dominant soil types. So you might be able to see it. There's a little red X kind of at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And that little red X, I just put it there because it's a forested area. So you click it when you're in this application, and what happens is it pulls up this list of sort of the major soil types within that area. So you can see here that Hagerstown soils are sort of the most prevalent in where I clicked. What's even cooler though is that you can click that Hagerstown link and then it shows a couple different things. It can show sort of the soil sketch, like if you were to take a core out there, it could show you sort of what you might find in the profile of what those soils are. And then what I think is super cool is that it also shows the extent of, in this case, this is Hagerstown soils. So the soils that we have on the property here are also found up kind of the Appalachian Ridge province here. So you can kind of go up into towards Harrisburg near State College, and then even further down towards Kingsport and Johnson City down sort of Southwest Virginia and even into Tennessee, and then kind of also in the Midwest as well. So the point is that, the trees that we see on our property here up in Keedysville, there might be similarities if we drove out to, say, mid Pennsylvania in these areas where the soils are similar. So another abiotic factor is light and terrain. Forest temperatures, soil moisture, and then species growth and composition are all really tightly linked to light availability and terrain. And so this image that I have here in the slide shows kind of the progression of the sun across the sky in the northern hemisphere. So you can see that, the sun rises in the east, it sets in the west, but oftentimes, as it moves across during the day, it's sort of at the southeast or southwest kind of aspect, and it doesn't sort of move over into the north. So there isn't really sun coming down from the north. And what that means is that trees grow differently, again, because of this sunlight availability. And especially when you're thinking of terrain, you're thinking of slopes and where those slopes are pointed, it can really have a pretty strong influence on what might exist. So this is an image from a fact sheet that was put together by an extension specialist out in Minnesota. So I'll put that link in the chat later on. But you can see here that, sun, as it raises in the east and then it's coming across towards the west, south-facing slopes often really get this intense sunlight for the duration of the day. So those slopes are often hot and dry. Because they're just getting a ton of solar radiation, much more comparatively than a north-facing slope. What's kind of interesting is that many of the mountains and the ridges that we have in Maryland face the slopes faces either directly east or directly west. So you might not find as much of a difference in sort of what grows, but if you look at a map, the mountains then kind of turn direction as you go further south or further northeast in Pennsylvania or in Virginia. So you can see these differences a bit more, and we'll see that a little bit later on. I thought this was a really cool resource. So this is a study that was done by, I believe that it was a Maryland Department of Transportation and then sort of the geology unit within probably Maryland DNR. But they sort of did a report on the different types of roads across the state and focused in on Allegheny County. So this is a photo of sort of a slope that goes down to a roadside, but this is a directly north-facing slope. And what they pointed out is that there's a lot of deciduous trees growing here. There's less direct sun, so that means that the moisture in the soil sort of stays for longer and it can freeze, these freeze-thaw cycles, because of the cooler temperatures as well. So all of that sort of equates to sort of a richer soil complex that can support things like deciduous trees or species like deciduous trees. Whereas literally right across the road, there's a directly east-facing slope, and they found that there's much more direct sun, which sort of discouraged growth of trees. That there's hotter, less moisture, and drier. You'll see there's some conifers growing there, so there are tree species that are really well adapted to dry conditions and sort of high sun conditions. But there is sort of this direct contrast between north facing and south facing. So again, just kind of things that people keep in mind when they're looking at a property and saying, okay, where's this property facing in terms of the direction? And that might, again, in conjunction with the soils, sort of indicate what trees are growing there and why they're growing in either patches or strips or whatever. This is a satellite image from Google Earth. This is of what I was talking about in Southwest Virginia. So instead of the mountains kind of oriented in a north-south direction, the ridge sort of turns and the ridge is almost facing east to west. So you'll see that there's this really kind of distinct band of color here, whereas the southeast facing slope it doesn't really have as much sort of tree species growing there. So it's just like higher light, much drier, much hotter. So the trees that are there, there's much less of them comparatively to the slope facing directly sort of northwest, where there's just far less sort of radiant energy on those slopes there. So again, just kind of cool. If you cruise around on Google Earth, you can sort of see these differences when you're looking at a ridge line. And it's not just because of shadows, it's because of sort of the radiant energy coming down based on sort of how that slope is arranged in space. Okay, so then we're switching from abiotic factors now to biotic factors. And so this sort of set of slides talks about shade tolerance. And so trees vary in the requirement for sunlight. This impacts when and where trees grow. So there's basically a spectrum of shade intolerant to shade tolerant tree species. And if you go into a forest ecosystem, you often see trees kind of self-arrange based on their sunlight tolerance, more or less. And we'll get into that later, but um, for instance, the photos that you see in this slide are sweet gum and American sycamore. So these are trees you see all over the place in Maryland, but they're really shade intolerant, which means that they need full sunlight to do well. So if, say, a forest gets clear cut, especially in sort of the coastal plain area of Maryland, what often happens is that sweet gum is the first thing to grow back up, besides other invasive species or weeds or whatever. Like this is kind of the first tree species that sprouts out because it's super shade intolerant, which means it does great when there's full sunlight. And it really tries to capitalize on that in sort of thinking about competition between different tree species. Same thing with sycamore as well. So these are kind of they're called pioneer species when you're thinking about succession, which we'll delve into later. But these are kind of the first at the scene when there is a big sort of light opening and those seed sources are there. Intermediate, pretty well explained with their title of intermediate, I guess. The photos here are of white oak, state tree, and then red maple as well. So these trees kind of they're sort of in the mid-range between sort of their light needs. And then shade tolerant species are things like sugar maple. What the photos here show are American beech, and then that's hemlock as well. There's hemlock far out in Western Maryland, but those are often sort of what happens in forests is that they often hang out in sort of the understory or the mid-story, and they can do what they can live for many, many years without much light at all. So they're pretty good in the shade. And then if there is a light opening, then they kind of capitalize on that and sort of become the next canopy layer. But these species are often found in kind of those mid to understory layers just because they can they can handle it comparatively to like a sweet gum that kind of can't. Regeneration. So regeneration just basically refers to how trees come back if they're removed, either through cutting or natural disturbances. So trees grow from fertilized seeds, but many regenerate after a disturbance through stump and root sprouting. You'll probably see this, if you have a crepe myrtle, for instance, in your yard. If you cut the crepe myrtle, you'll often see tons of sprouts come out from the stump if you cut it that far down. Um, and many tree species do this. And so forest managers often use these regeneration mechanisms when they're thinking about making any kind of manipulations within a forest ecosystem. So these are photos I took. This is a property down in the Eastern Shore. This is yellow poplar or tulip tree, as some people call it. These are super prolific stump spreaders. So the photo on the right shows a stump. That's kind of the far right part of the photo, or far left part of the photo, excuse me. It shows a stump that was cut, and then all these different sprouts, have come up from where that stump is, and that's kind of a close-up on the right side of the screen. So what ends up happening again, these sprouts grow and grow and they compete with one another, and then one or two tend to sort of dominate the others. But the point is that there's just high level of sort of regeneration that comes from when these disturbances happen, and then there's more sunlight in the area. Root sprouting is another thing. So that photo shows American beech, and they're pretty prolific root sprouters. They're sometimes called suckers as well. So roots will go out into the soil, and then these trees, especially when they're stressed, they send out sprouts from the root system. So they can form these really dense thickets of, in this case, beech. Um, and this photo was taken in the Northeast US, which in New York and Vermont, New Hampshire, beech is kind of an issue because of how prolific these stump sprouts can be. Sort of there's this mother tree, and then, there can be kind of a big array of stump sprouters that come from that. But then again, we also know that seed is it's a major player in how trees sort of come back onto the landscape if there is any sort of opening or disturbance. So these two photos here show, just massive regeneration, sort of based on seed banks, which is what, basically seeds that hang out in the soil that wait for light to then sort of shoot up sprouts here. So those are sugar maples on the left side of the screen, and then loblolly pine on the right side of the screen. So the sugar maples, again, they're pretty shade tolerant, so they can hang out in that really shady sort of closed canopy forest for a long period of time, before, if there's another disturbance and a bit more sunlight comes in, then they'll sort of compete to then kind of become the main canopy type species. Whereas I think loblolly pine is much more shade intolerant. And all these dynamics really kind of are leading to this idea of natural succession. Many of you have probably heard of it, you might not have, and if you haven't, natural succession is this concept that, forests progress through stages over time, and these stages are marked by different sizes, distributions, and species of trees. So it's kind of a more succinct way of what I was trying to get at these last couple slides. But if you look at a forest cross-section over time, you can see that if you let a field kind of regrow back into a forested area, which to those who tuned in last time, that's sort of what happened with a lot of the forest land in our state and across the East Coast US. What happened is there's these, what first seeds in are shrubs and the shrubby layer, and then the shade intolerant species then kind of sprout in. So like I mentioned, the sweet gum, but in this case, you see yellow poplar, cherry, some sort of birches like paper birch, especially up in the Northeast. That's a pretty prolific kind of pioneer species. And then over time, those might die or get shaded out or whatever. And then the more intermediate and tolerant tree species then become the sort of dominant canopy layer. Things like oaks, sugar maple, and then beech sometimes too. And what's kind of cool about this concept, I think, is that, different successional stages are correspond with different kinds of wildlife as well. So if we're thinking about forests as ecosystems again, and the species that hang out in forests and the genetic diversity, we also want forests and ecosystems to have different kinds of successional stages represented on the landscape. This graphic again comes from the Woods in Your Backyard guide, but you can see that the early successional habitat is really good for things like quail, woodcock, rabbit, whereas the sort of closed canopy, mature conditions of like late successional mature forests, those are good for squirrels or kind of interior dwelling birds like warblers and scarlet tanagers and things like that. I'm not a birder, but I'd like to become one. So we just know that like as succession progresses, different kinds of wildlife can thrive depending on the successional stage. And then even further down to the sort of individual tree, this is an image from that textbook that I showed earlier. This just basically shows that if and when a tree dies in a forest and is left as a snag or a wildlife tree, it can again support just a range of different bird species. So as this tree begins to die and loses its needles and its bark, different birds like a hawk or a flycatcher, and then down to a woodpecker and down to a chickadee, basically all these things sort of have their niche depending on a stage of the tree's decomposition as well. So pretty cool there too. Okay. As I promised, we're gonna sort of take all these big concepts and put them together and superimpose them in Maryland forests or across Maryland's landscape. So as you might know, Maryland's in this really cool kind of crossroads between climates. So the annual extreme minimum temperature is sort of reflected in areas up in the Northeast, but then we also have pockets of Maryland that are sort of more reflective of sort of further in the Southeast. So we have climate playing a role here. We also have our provinces. These are ecoregions across the state, and so all these ecoregions are based by the soil and geology. So the again, kind of the diversity of this state, both in its soils and the different sort of terrain that's out there, and again, like sort of how the sun hits that terrain. All these things basically play a role in influencing what trees are growing across the state. And so one way to characterize groups of trees and in a more succinct way than just saying, oh, there's a group of tree here and there's a group of trees there. There's this concept called natural communities, which is defined as reoccurring groups of plants and animals found in particular physical environments. So these are more kind of compact than an ecosystem. So instead of a forest ecosystem, there are forest natural communities as well. And it's a really helpful way to, again, sort of put a name to some of the patterns that you might see as you go out into the woods or go into the landscape. Maryland is not the only state that uses this natural communities concept. It's, I think, pretty much everywhere throughout the US. And so DNR, our DNR, has put together this guide of natural communities in Maryland. I'll put the link to this resource in the chat at the end. But how this document works is that you can look at different bins of systems. So if we look at terrestrial systems comparatively to aquatic, in terrestrial systems, there are forest ecosystems, and then there's all these different kinds of natural communities of forests that exist. And so those natural communities, I just chose one. This is this is like a beech hickory oak type forest, which is really common throughout sort of the central part of the state, most of the state, honestly. But you can sort of go from these different natural communities and understand sort of one, where they are, but then two, kind of their conservation status as well. And then these websites, these resources also sort of give you an idea of what you might expect. So it's almost like using a dichotomous key, sort of if you're in a patch of woods or a woodland ecosystem and you're seeing these different kind of species, both in the herbaceous layer, but then in the trees as well, you can kind of back reference this to a natural community, sort of again, sort of this bounded unit of what might be there and why. I just wanted to point this out. So like Plummer's Island, some of you might have heard of it, maybe some of you haven't. Apparently it's the most thoroughly studied island in North America. It's also located right underneath the 495 bridge between Maryland and Virginia. I've never been, I'd love to go, but I guess scientists, biologists, people have been going out there for years and years and years doing, since I think they're 1901, doing research on what exists there and what impacts, development might be having on our landscape. But what I wanted to point out was this map of Plummer's Island. So you'll see this colorful, all these different blobs, and all those colorful blobs and shapes refer back to different natural community types. So you can see that even in this, I don't know the acreage of the island, but it's fairly small given the grand scheme of what Maryland is. Even within this fairly bounded island forested ecosystem, there's what, 12 different natural communities, if not more, that are sort of coexisting on this different landscape. And there are sort of overlaps, but these natural communities, again, are influenced by things like the soils and the aspect and the terrain. So, how do site factors influence these patterns? How do tree characteristics influence these patterns? Um, I pointed out section number 10. So this is a natural community called the Mid-Atlantic High Terrace Hardwood Floodplain Forest, which means, that it's relatively lower in elevation, it gets flooded, and so the soils might be sort of more moist than soils further up on ridges, for instance, and potentially have more nutrients just given that there's been flooding. So the dominant tree species that grow there are red maple, white ash. I'm not sure if there's much ash there anymore because of emerald ash borer outbreaks, but then hornbeam as well, which is a pretty notorious mid-story. Sometimes it's called ironwood as well. But the point is that, there's these sort of lower lying areas, and then you can kind of think through, okay, how do the, different factors here at the site dictate what grows here? Um, and then sort of moving up, so I don't, you can see there's different contour lines in the map, and these 12 blobs that I point out are much higher, not much, but they're tens of feet higher up in elevation than, say, the the natural communities that I previously pointed out. But these ones are called Potomac River Bedrock Terrace Hardpan Forest. And what is dominant there are pignut hickory, red oak, and chestnut oak. So these are trees that are really good with growing in sort of shallower soils, more ledgy environments, things that, don't get flooded as much, for instance. And then there's also, the influence of light here too. So the point is that, this is one instance of one different location in this, or one, specific location in the state of Maryland, but it does, deal with these factors such as light availability, water availability, the types of soils that exist, and the nutrients that are in the soils. All these things kind of play together to create quite a bit of variation in the dominant tree species that are growing, again, in this tiny little, pocket of land right off 495 there. So this is a physiographic map of Maryland. Again, I'll put this link in the chat. It's fascinating to go through. It's really high resolution, so you can zoom in and get a sense of topography, and then reference back to different types of physiographic regions within provinces. But the point is that, again, I mentioned this tiny little island. Maryland is this fairly large state with tons of diversity in terms of the landscape, in terms of the soils, in terms of how the sun interacts with these places. And so, the trees that grow across the state vary quite a bit. And these are kind of the factors that underpin why trees grow where they do. So to kind of wrap things up, again, the factors shaping Maryland forests are closely tied to biodiversity. And biodiversity is really important, as we saw. And then these factors help us to understand forests today and in the future. So I will end with that. As I mentioned earlier, I really sort of thrive on feedback from you all, just to get a sense of how I can do this better. And if you have any ideas for future programming, what that might look like. So I just put a link in the chat. I put a million links in the chat, but the feedback one is at the very bottom of my chat box there. So please, I would encourage you to do that if you have the time. And then the other QR code that I showed here is the Fall Forestry webinar series. If you haven't signed up for the final session in December, I encourage you